Finally, let's talk about a couple of older systems in the administrative realm of Hadoop. They aren't really in use anymore, but I still see references to them here and there. So mostly the purpose of this lesson is just to expand your Hadoop vocabulary. One of these older systems is called Ganglia, and that's an old monitoring system for Hadoop that was originally developed by UC Berkeley. It got some pretty good adoption within the university scene, and at one point Wikimedia and Wikipedia were using it as well. In fact, it's still running on Wikimedia. But today it's largely supplanted by things like Ambari or Cloudera Manager, and there's also something very pretty called Grafana that you can run on top of Ambari metrics to have very pretty dashboards of your operations of your cluster. So basically the idea of Ganglia is to monitor your cluster, make sure the CPU usage is okay, jobs aren't getting backed up, things like that, disks aren't getting full, operational details of the overall health of your cluster. And I got to tell you, it wasn't pretty. I mean, for back when it was written, perfectly good stuff. If I had to write this, 10 years ago, it probably would have looked the same way. But by today's standards, this looks a little bit ghetto, right? And, it kind of shows that it hasn't been updated in a very long time. Compare that to a modern interface like Grafana running on top of Ambari, and you can see it's much easier to read, much easier on the eyes, and more of a modern display. And I'm sure it's, obviously built more for today's clusters than the ones that existed 10 years ago. I mean, just compare these two. It's kind of sad because if you go to the Ganglia website, there's a live demo link that points you here to Wikimedia's implementation of Ganglia. But right at the top of this page, it says Ganglia is deprecated in favor of Grafana. And that takes you to the Grafana page here instead. So I think it's safe to say that Ganglia is dead today, but it's good to know what it was. If you go to the Ganglia website, it's largely broken. That's usually a bad sign when there's a bunch of broken links on there. And the last time it was updated was in 2008. But again, if you're coming across a really old system, you might see it mentioned, and in older documentation or literature, you might also see some mentions of Ganglia. But with today's operational dashboards through the Cloudera Manager or Ambari, it's really seen its day and it's been replaced. Now, don't feel too bad for the people who wrote Ganglia. These guys were pioneers in the field of big data, so I'm pretty sure they're probably making lots of money somewhere these days. Something else that's seen better days is something called Chuckwa, and this was an old system for collecting and analyzing logs from your Hadoop cluster. So whenever you have a big cluster of computers, just the problem of collecting all of the log data and aggregating them is actually fairly challenging. And Chuckwa was a system initially adopted by Netflix to solve that problem. The thing is, today, people usually use either Flume or Kafka for this same problem. And these are more modern systems that are built to be more general purpose and not just for a Hadoop cluster. And they're also a lot faster. With Chuckwa, you might get latencies of minutes in terms of propagating your logs, but with something like Flume, it's more instantaneous, seconds at most. It's also a little bit easier to set up and configure Flume and Kafka, and they are also demonstrably more reliable. Chuckwa hasn't changed since 2010. The website, again, just like Ganglia, is largely broken, lots of broken links, and there's really no usage to speak of today. I saw a quote from someone at Cloudera saying that in all of their days at Cloudera, they've never seen anyone using Chuckwa. So its day has come and passed, but again, you may see references to it in older literature or on older systems. So I just want you to know about Chuckwa and Ganglia, and now you know what they are. To recap, Ganglia, an old monitoring system used for Hadoop; Chuckwa, an old log aggregation system that was used with Hadoop, but both have been supplanted by more modern systems. So there you have it, all the stuff that runs on your cluster that kind of makes it all hum together and work. And we've touched on some other technologies as well that we haven't gone into as much depth on. There's just so many utilities and tools and technologies out there in the world of Hadoop and cluster computing in general. It's kind of hard to cover them all. There's new ones coming out all the time. But you know what? We're actually getting toward the end of this course, believe it or not. We just have one more thing to really talk about, and that's streaming data. So we're going to talk in the next section about ways of streaming data in real time to your cluster. Then we'll talk about how to consume that data and process it. And finally, we'll tie it all together and talk about designing larger applications that actually meet real business requirements on your cluster and how to put all these different components together that we've talked about. So we're getting there. Stay with me. See you in the next section.